5 years ago, on a night just like this, the rain tried to wash away a sin. On the edge of the Royce Group skyscraper, a woman stood between life and death. Alara Wynne, pregnant, broken, and framed for a crime she didn't commit. She looked at her husband, Seelan Royce, hoping for a sliver of mercy. But Seelan didn't offer a hand. He offered a cold command. If you're going to jump, do it quickly. She jumped. Or so the world thought. Now, 5 years later, the Royce Grand Ballroom is a sea of gold and lies. It's the 50th anniversary of the family that destroyed her. At the center table sits the CEO himself, Seelan Royce. He's more powerful than ever, and twice as cold. Beside him is Maribel Voss, the woman who stole Alara's life, now wearing the Royce family diamonds like a trophy. The lights suddenly die. A single piercing spotlight hits the stage. A figure appears. She is the masked swan, a world-renowned dancer whose identity is a mystery kept behind silver filigree. She is draped in crimson silk that flows like blood. As the music swells, she doesn't just dance, she attacks the air. Her movements are a jagged, beautiful memory of betrayal. In the audience, Kalen Royce freezes, his glass shatters in his hand. He's looking at a ghost, but he doesn't know it yet. He only knows that his heart, frozen for 5 years, has just begun to burn. The dance ends in a death pose at Kalen's feet. The room is silent until the matriarch, Vivienne Royce, demands to know the dancer's name. The woman speaks. Her voice is a melody of ice. It's called the widow's debt, Madame Royce. A tribute to things that refuse to stay buried. Seelan stands, his shadow towering over her. He demands she remove the mask. He wants to see the eyes that haunt his dreams. But Alara only smiles. She lures him into the moonlight of the garden, leading the predator into her own trap. Under the hunter's moon, the mask finally falls. Kalen staggers back, his face turning the color of ash. He whispers a name he hasn't dared to say in years. Alara? But the woman standing before him isn't the girl he abandoned. She steps close, her breath ghosting over his ear as she pins a red rose to his chest. Alara Wynne died in the rain, Seelan, she whispers. I'm just the bill you forgot to pay. And I've come back to collect. With interest. The game has changed. The prey is now the hunter. And Alara Wynne's revenge has only just begun. The moon hung low over the Royce estate as Kalen stood frozen in the garden, the shattered remains of his composure lying at his feet like the glass he had dropped. Alara's words lingered in the air, a lethal vow whispered against the backdrop of rustling leaves. Before he could find his voice, she vanished into the shadows, leaving him with nothing but the scent of roses and a crushing weight in his chest. He was the man who had everything, yet in that moment, he felt like a beggar staring at a ghost. Inside the glittering ballroom, Vivienne Royce watched her grandson's hollow return with a sharp, calculating gaze. She saw the tremor in his hands and the haunted look in his eyes, a look he hadn't worn since the night the rooftop claimed his soul. Vivienne didn't know the dancer's true identity, but she knew power when she saw it. The masked swan had done in 10 minutes what a dozen therapists and 100 board meetings couldn't. She had cracked Kalen's icy exterior. The following morning, Vivienne summoned the dancer to the Royce ancestral villa. She offered a contract that was more of a royal decree than a business proposal. Alara sat across from the matriarch, her silver mask reflecting the morning sun, her posture perfect. Vivienne slid a check across the mahogany table, an amount that could fund an entire wing of a hospital. Kalen has become a machine, cold and unreachable, Vivienne stated, her voice thick with authority. Tame him. Bring the man back to life, or at least remind him he has a heart that can still bleed. Do this, and the Royce family will be your eternal patron. Alara's fingers brushed the check, the price of Lyra's survival. She signed the contract of fate with a steady hand, knowing she wasn't just taming a beast, she was baiting a trap. But Alara's world was split in two. While she played the mysterious enchantress at the villa, her heart resided in a sterile hospital room. Later that afternoon, Kalen visited the Royce-funded pediatric wing for a mandatory PR appearance. He hated hospitals. They smelled of the weakness he tried to suppress, until he saw her. A small girl, no more than 5, sat in a playroom corner, hunched over a complex mechanical puzzle that would have stumped an engineer. Kalen stopped in his tracks. The girl, Lyra, looked up, and for the first time in his life, Kalen felt a physical jolt of recognition. She didn't look like Alara. She looked exactly like the portraits of his late mother. The same high brow, the same stubborn set of the jaw. "You're doing it wrong," the little genius said, her voice small but piercing. "The gears need a central axis to rotate." Salen knelt beside her, drawn by an invisible thread. He felt a strange, terrifying warmth in his chest as he helped her click the pieces into place. He had no idea he was touching his own blood. Nor did he see Alara watching from the doorway, her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob of pure terror. The tension between their three worlds collided a week later at the villa. Kaelin's obsession with the masked dancer had reached a breaking point. He found her in the library, the moonlight casting long shadows over the rows of books. He cornered her, his breath ragged. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "You play with my grandmother. You haunt my hospital, and you move like a woman I buried." The argument escalated into a storm of suppressed rage and buried longing. "You didn't bury her, Kaelin. You discarded her," she spat back. In a fit of desperate frustration, Kaelin reached out and tore the silver mask from her face. The silk ribbons snapped. Time seemed to stop. The moonlight hit her face, and the truth crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Alara was alive. The woman he had cursed, the woman he had told to jump, was standing before him. Beautiful, vengeful, and devastatingly real. As Kaelin reeled from the discovery, Alara fled to the one person she trusted, Dr. Silas Hart. In the dim light of his office, she collapsed into a chair, the mask clutched in her trembling hands. "He knows, Silas. He knows I'm alive." Silas knelt before her, his eyes filled with a protective devotion that Selen had never offered. "Then we move faster," Silas urged. He handed her Lyra's latest charts, a grim reminder of why they were there. Alara looked at the debt of blood written in medical code. She swore Silas to absolute secrecy. Kaelin can never know about Lyra's illness. If he finds out she's his, he'll take her. He'll lock her in a Royce-gilded cage and turn her into a version of himself. I'd rather die again than let him touch her soul. But the enemies were already circling. Maribel Voss, sensing her grip on the Royce throne slipping, orchestrated a charity trap. At a high society auction, she planted a priceless Royce heirloom, a blue diamond brooch, in Alara's dressing room and called the authorities. She wanted Alara arrested, publicly, shamed and erased. But Maribel's arrogance was her undoing. While she focused on the theft, Silas was digging into the past. In a hidden archive, Silas discovered the truth in the files. He found the original medical records from 5 years ago. Maribel had never been pregnant. The miscarriage that had ruined Alara's life was a masterpiece of forgery created by Dorian Voss. The blood on the stairs had been a prop, and the tragedy a theatrical play. Desperation turned Maribel lethal. When she realized the truth was leaking and that Lyra was indeed Kaelin's daughter, she chose the ultimate weapon. She didn't want the child. She wanted a shield. Her father, Dorian, was dying, and he needed a perfect bone marrow match. Maribel kidnapped Lyra from the hospital, intending to use the little genius as a biological harvest for her criminal father. The story reached its boiling point during a gala that was live-streamed to millions. Alara didn't call the police first. She called for justice. As Maribel stood on stage, playing the grieving fiancé, the giant screens behind her flickered to life. It wasn't a tribute to the Royce family. It was a recording of Maribel's own voice, caught by Alara's hidden wire, confessing to the framing and the kidnapping. The ballroom erupted in chaos. The doors burst open, and the police charged in, but they were preceded by a figure no one expected, Alaric Royce. Selen's elder brother, the coma survivor, walked into the room, his presence a silent thunderbolt that shattered Maribel's lies forever. He had woken up, and he remembered everything. In the end, the brilliant retribution was complete. Maribel and Dorian were led away in handcuffs, their screams echoing in the marble halls. Alara stood under the center spotlight, not as a dancer or a victim, but as a mother who had saved her child. She looked at Kaelin one last time. He stood in the pouring rain outside the gala, his expensive suit soaked, his face a mask of agony. He finally understood the weight of his regret, that he had traded a diamond for a stone and a daughter's love for a lie. Alara turned her back on him and walked into the light, finally free. The morning following the gala did not bring peace to the Royce household. Instead, it brought a cold, calculated shift in the family's power dynamics. Inside the sun-drenched morning room of the Royce villa, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tea, and the heavy silence of a matriarch deep in thought. Vivienne Royce sat perfectly upright, her sharp eyes fixed on the woman across from her. To Vivienne, the masked swan was more than a world-class dancer. She was a miracle worker who had achieved the impossible. She had provoked a genuine, visceral reaction from her grandson, Seelan. Vivienne placed a leather-bound folder on the mahogany table, pushing it toward the woman who still wore her silver filigree mask even in the daylight. The matriarch spoke with the authority of someone used to buying the world's compliance. She described Seelan as a man who had become a machine, a hollow shell of a CEO whose heart had been cauterized by a tragedy 5 years prior. She didn't want a dancer. She wanted a specialist. She offered a contract of fate, a formal agreement for the woman to remain close to Seelan, to tame his erratic coldness and act as a social companion that might finally push him toward a semblance of humanity. The price Vivienne was willing to pay was astronomical, enough to fund the most advanced medical treatments in the world. Across the table, Alara Wynne felt the weight of the document under her fingertips. She knew that signing this meant stepping directly into the lion's den, but as she thought of the mounting hospital bills for her daughter, Lyra, she knew there was no other choice. She picked up the fountain pen and signed the contract with a steady hand. She wasn't just accepting a job, she was accepting a ticket to the front lines of her own revenge. She played the part of the mysterious artist perfectly, offering Vivienne a cryptic promise that she would give Seelan exactly what he deserved. The news of the contract spread through the villa like a wildfire. When Kalen received the word, his reaction was a storm of silent fury and repressed curiosity. He stormed into his grandmother's study, demanding to know why she had invited a stranger into their private lives. But Vivienne merely smiled, reminding him that he had been the one who couldn't take his eyes off the dancer at the gala. She challenged his control, suggesting that if he was truly as strong as he claimed, a mere dancer shouldn't be able to disturb his peace. While Kalen grappled with his grandmother's interference, Maribel Voss was beginning to feel the first tremors of panic. She had spent 5 years cementing her place as the future matriarch of the Royce family, but the arrival of this masked woman felt like a direct threat to her throne. She watched from the balcony as the dancer moved through the gardens, a crimson flash against the greenery. Maribel sensed a familiarity in the woman's gait that made her blood run cold. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in rivals. As the chapter closed, the contract was signed, the trap was set, and the taming of Seelan Royce began, a process that would eventually strip away his defenses and leave him vulnerable to the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The pediatric wing of City Central Hospital was a world of forced cheerfulness, brightly painted murals of sunflowers and blue skies that couldn't quite mask the persistent metallic tang of disinfectant. In room 402, the atmosphere was far more serious than the decor intended. There sat Lyra Wynne, a 5-year-old whose eyes held the weary depth of a scholar rather than the innocence of a preschooler. She was currently hunched over a complex set of blueprints and a half-assembled miniature steam engine, her brow furrowed in a concentration so intense it seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. Outside the door, Alara stood in the shadows of the corridor, disguised in a nurse's oversized scrub suit and a heavy medical mask. To the world, she was the masked swan, but here, she was a mother holding her breath. She watched through the small observation window as a tall, imposing figure turned the corner. Kalen Royce walked through the hospital wing like a god forced to walk among mortals. He was there for a mandatory philanthropic photo op, flanked by a few nervous hospital administrators and a bored-looking PR assistant. Kalen stopped abruptly in front of room 402. He had passed a dozen other children who waved or stared in awe at his expensive suit. But this room was different. He saw a child who didn't even look up as he entered. He signaled for his entourage to remain in the hall, stepped inside and closed the door. The silence was immediate. Keelan stood at the foot of the bed, watching the girl work. He felt a strange, inexplicable prickle at the back of his neck, a biological recognition he couldn't name. The pressure valve is misaligned, Kalen said, his voice deep and cutting through the silence. If you tighten the secondary bolt before securing the seal, the steam will bypass the piston entirely. Lyra didn't flinch. She slowly looked up, her piercing dark eyes meeting his. Seelen felt a physical jolt. She didn't look like Alara. She looked exactly like the vet portraits of the Royce family matriarchs hanging in the villa's grand hall. The same high, aristocratic forehead, and the same stubborn, slightly arrogant set of the jaw. "I'm not tightening it yet," Lyra replied, her voice small but remarkably steady. "I'm testing the tension of the spring first. And you're standing in my light. If you want to help, move 3 inches to the left. If you want to talk, go find someone who isn't busy." Seelen was stunned. In the boardroom, men twice his age trembled when he spoke. Yet this tiny, pale creature had just dismissed him with the casual indifference of a queen. Instead of being angry, he felt a surge of genuine, rare amusement. He moved 3 inches to the left. In the hallway, Alara's heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she feared the doctors would hear it. She watched Kalen kneel beside the bed, his luxury watch catching the light as he reached out to steady the tiny engine for Lyra. He was being gentle, a trait she had thought him incapable of possessing. She saw the way his eyes softened as he looked at the girl. A look of profound, confused fascination. He's looking at his own soul, she thought, and he doesn't even know it. The interaction was interrupted by a sharp cough. Alara stepped into the room, her head bowed, playing the role of the dutiful nurse. She needed to break this connection before it became a bond. She kept her voice low and muffled by the mask, informing the CEO that the patient needed her vitals checked and that the PR team was waiting for him in the lobby. Kalen stood up slowly, his eyes lingering on Lyra. He told the nurse to ensure the girl had anything she required, the best specialists, the most advanced equipment, and to bill it directly to his private office. He left the room without a second glance at the nurse, but as he walked down the hall, he was visibly shaken. He didn't understand why a stranger's child made him feel as though he had just rediscovered a missing part of himself. Once he was gone, Alara collapsed into the chair Kalen had just vacated. She pulled down her mask, gasping for air as if she had been underwater. Lyra looked at her mother, her genius mind already calculating the tension in the room. "That man," Lyra said softly, "he's the one from the pictures you tried to hide, isn't he? He's the reason we have to stay behind masks." Alara couldn't lie to her daughter. She never could. She took Lyra's small, frail hand in hers and whispered that the man was part of a past that no longer existed. But the truth was far more dangerous. The little genius had met the cold CEO, and the blood calling to blood was a force even Alara's brilliance might not be able to stop. As the afternoon light faded, the reality of their situation returned. Alara looked at Lyra's latest medical charts, which were hidden beneath the blueprints. The girl was fading. Her bone marrow was failing, and the search for a donor had turned up nothing but dead ends. The only perfect matches would be immediate family, and the only family Lyra had left was the man who had just walked out the door. The weight of the debt of blood now took on a terrifying new meaning. Alara realized she was trapped in a horrific paradox. To save her daughter's life, she would have to reveal Lyra's existence to Seelen, the very man she had vowed to destroy. She would have to hand her greatest treasure over to the man who had discarded them both. Meanwhile, back at the Royce villa, Seelen sat in his darkened study, ignoring the calls from his board of directors and the nagging voice of Maribel Voss outside his door. He was staring at a photo of his mother taken when she was 6 years old. The resemblance to the girl in room 402 wasn't just a coincidence, it was a haunting. He began to do the math. The dates of Alara's death, the age of the child, the secrets his grandmother seemed to be keeping. The ice around his heart was melting, but it was being replaced by a cold, sharp suspicion that he had been the victim of a massive 5-year deception. Maribel, sensing the shift in the air, hammered on his door. "Kalen, your grandmother is asking for you. That dancer is here again for the training session." Kalen didn't answer. He gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. He was a hunter by nature, and he had just caught a scent he couldn't ignore. The game was no longer about a contract or a taming, it was about the truth. and as Alara prepared for her evening taming session with him, she knew the mask was becoming a prison. The genius daughter, the heartless father, and the vengeful mother were now locked in a collision course, and when they finally hit, the explosion would level the entire Royce empire. Alara stood before the mirror, donning her silver mask for the evening performance. She looked at her reflection. A woman reborn from ash. She had come for revenge, but now she was fighting for a life far more precious than her own. She whispered a final vow to the silent room. She would save Lyra, even if it meant burning herself to the ground to do it. The war had truly begun. The night air at the Royce villa was thick with the scent of jasmine and the unspoken weight of 5 years of lies. Alara sat in the grand library, the firelight dancing off the silver filigree of her mask. She wasn't just here to dance for a paycheck. She was here to dismantle a kingdom from the inside out. The double doors burst open. Seelan Royce stood in the threshold, his tie loosened, his breathing ragged, and his eyes wild with a mixture of obsession and fury. He had spent the last week haunted by 2 images: the mysterious masked woman who moved like a ghost, and the little girl in the hospital who looked like his own soul. He had tried to be a machine, but the machine was breaking. "Who are you?" Seelan demanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the silent room. "You signed my grandmother's contracts. You haunt my hospital halls, and you speak to me as if you know the weight of every sin I've ever committed. What is your game?" He lunged forward, his hands gripping her shoulders with a desperation that bordered on violence. The power dynamic that had defined their past, the invincible CEO and the discarded pregnant wife, was disintegrating in the heat of the moment. Alara didn't flinch. She leaned into him, her voice a sharp, icy blade that cut through his arrogance. "Maybe I'm just the mirror you're afraid to look into, Seelan," she whispered. "You spent 5 years pretending the past didn't happen. Did you think the world would just let you forget the girl you left in the rain?" "Enough games," Seelan roared. In a blind fit of frustration, Seelan reached out, his fingers hooked under the silk ribbons behind her head. With a violent tug, the silver filigree snapped and clattered to the marble floor. Silence, heavy and suffocating, filled the library. The moonlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the face Kalen had seen in his nightmares every night since the rooftop. The dead wife stood before him, her eyes cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. She wasn't the trembling, broken girl who had begged for his mercy. She was a woman reborn, beautiful and lethal. Kalen staggered back, his face turning the color of ash. His voice was a choked whisper, barely able to form the name. "Alara? You're alive." "I'm alive, Seelan," she replied, her voice steady and devoid of warmth. "No thanks to you. Did you think the abyss was deep enough to keep me? Or did you think your umbrella was enough to keep you dry from the storm I was bringing back?" Seelan reached out, his hand trembling, wanting to touch her cheek to prove she wasn't a hallucination born of his own mounting guilt. But Alara slapped his hand away, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the room. She stood tall, informing him that he had lost the right to touch her the moment he chose Maribel's lies over her life. She told him that she was here for the contract, but when he finally fell, it wouldn't be from a roof, it would be at her feet. As Alara swept out of the room, leaving him paralyzed in the dark, she looked at a hidden message from Dr. Silas Hart. The debt of blood was deeper than she had ever imagined. Silas had found the original files from 5 years ago. Maribel's miscarriage had been a total masterpiece of forgery. Kalen had discarded his wife and unborn child for a lie that never existed. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the upstairs landing, Maribel Voss had watched the mask fall. Her face was distorted with a predatory rage. She knew the ghost was back. And as she hissed into her phone to her father, Dorian Voss, she made a vow. If Alara Wynne was alive, she would have to be killed a second time, and this time, there would be no survivors to tell the tale. The mask was gone. The war had finally moved into the light. And as the moon moved behind a cloud, the Royce villa became a house of shadows, where every secret was a weapon, and every heartbeat was a countdown to a final, brilliant retribution. The silence that followed the unmasking of Alara Wynne was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure that precedes a devastating storm. Inside the dimly lit library of the Royce villa, Keelan Royce felt as though the very air had turned to shards of glass in his lungs. He stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the woman he had mourned, hated, and obsessively searched for in every crowd for 5 long years. Alara did not give him the satisfaction of a breakdown. She stood amidst the ruins of her disguise, her chin tilted upward, her gaze as sharp and unforgiving as a winter morning. To Keelan, she looked like a vengeful goddess carved from marble. To Alara, he looked like a man finally drowning in the shallow waters of his own lies. Without a word, Alara turned her back on the most powerful man in the city. She gathered her crimson skirts and swept out of the room, the click of her heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown to his destruction. Keelan made to follow her, his hand reaching out instinctively, but his legs felt leaden, anchored by the sheer weight of his realization. He had spent half a decade convinced of her guilt, only to find that the dead wife he had discarded was the only living thing left in his world. While Keelan stood in the shadows of the library, grappling with a reality that had been shattered in a single second, Alara fled to the one place where her mask was never needed. The city central hospital was quiet at this hour, the halls bathed in the soft blue glow of the nightlights. She bypassed the nurse's station, her heart hammering against her ribs, and slipped into the office of Dr. Silas Hart. Silas was waiting for her, his face grim under the harsh fluorescent lights. He didn't ask about the Royce villa. He didn't need to. He saw the raw, exposed nerves in her eyes and knew the mask had fallen. He simply handed her a medical folder, the debt of blood that had become the true center of her universe. "The latest marrow biopsy came back, Alara," Silas said, his voice heavy with a compassion that made her want to scream. "Lyra's blast cell count is rising. The medication is no longer holding the line. We are out of time. If we don't find a donor match within the next 14 days, her organs will begin to fail." Alara gripped the edge of his desk so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked at the charts, the jagged lines of Lyra's failing health, mocking her brilliant plans for revenge. She had come back to destroy the Royce family, but now she was being forced to beg for their blood. "I've searched every international database, Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There has to be someone, a distant relative, a stranger, anyone." "You know the statistics, Alara," Silas countered, stepping around the desk to place a steadying hand on her shoulder. "For a child with her specific markers, the only realistic hope is a biological parent. Keelan Royce is her father. His bone marrow is almost certainly the key to her survival." "No," Alara snapped, pulling away as if burned. "He doesn't get to save her. He doesn't get to play the hero after he tried to be her executioner 5 years ago. If he finds out she exists, he'll take her. He'll use the Royce lawyers to strip me of my rights, lock her in that cold villa, and turn her into a trophy. I would rather die again than let him know he has a daughter." The internal conflict was a physical agony. Alara was a mother standing on a razor's edge. On one side was her hatred for the man who had stood with an umbrella while she jumped. On the other was the life of the only person she truly loved. Silas watched her, his silence a heavy pressure. He knew that for all her brilliance, Alara was currently blinded by the smoke of her own war. "If you don't tell him," Silas said softly, "you aren't just protecting her from him. You're denying her the right to live. Is your revenge worth more than Lyra's heartbeat?" Alara collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The debt of blood wasn't just Keelan's debt to her. It was the price she was being asked to pay to keep her daughter alive. She swore Silas to absolute secrecy, a desperate, final attempt to maintain control. She told him that she would find another way, that she would squeeze the Royce family for every resource they had, but that Keelan must never know the truth about the little genius in room 402. But the shadows were moving in the hospital halls. While Alara and Silas spoke in hushed tones, a nurse, hired by Maribel Voss, stood near the door, her phone recording the muffled conversation. The secret that Alara was guarding with her life was already leaking through the cracks. Back at the villa, Keelan had finally moved. He hadn't gone to sleep. He had gone to his mother's old room, a place he hadn't entered in years. He sat on the floor, surrounded by old photo albums, comparing the faded pictures of a young Royce girl to the memory of Lyra Wynne. The logic was undeniable. The dates, the features, the little genius who had dismissed him with his own brand of arrogance, it all pointed to a single, staggering truth. He felt a sudden, violent urge to protect. For 5 years, his life had been a series of cold transactions and empty victories. Now he realized he had a legacy he had never claimed, a child he had unknowingly tried to kill. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made him gasp for air. He realized that Alara's return wasn't just about revenge, it was about survival. "I'll find out," Keelan vowed to the empty room, his eyes hardening with a new, singular purpose. "I'll find out why that child is in that hospital, and I'll find out what Alara is hiding, and if I have to burn this entire city to the ground to save them both, I will." As the first light of dawn began to touch the spires of the city, the two protagonists were locked in a silent, desperate race. Alara was trying to save her daughter without losing her soul, while Keelan was trying to find his soul by saving a daughter he didn't even know was his. Between them stood the debt of blood, a medical and emotional bill that was coming due. The pacing was no longer dictated by Alara's dance steps or Seelan's business deals. It was dictated by the steady, weakening beep of a heart monitor in room 402. The war of the Royce family was about to become a battle for a single life, and as the chapter closed, the villains were already preparing their final move. Maribel Voss had the recording. She had the motive, and she was about to turn Alara's debt of blood into a death sentence for everyone involved. The high society circles of the city were buzzing like a hornet's nest. The masked swan was no longer just a dancer. She was a ghost made flesh, and the revelation of her true identity had sent shockwaves through the Royce empire. But Alara Wynne had no time for the whispers of the elite. Every second that passed was a second stolen from her daughter's life. As the sun began to set on a particularly cold Tuesday, the Royce Charity Foundation announced its annual Gala of Hope. It was an event designed for the wealthy to perform their generosity, but for Maribel Voss, it was the perfect stage for an execution. Maribel had spent the last 48 hours in a state of manic desperation. She had seen the way Keelan looked at Alara in the library, a look of shattered devotion that Maribel had never been able to earn. She knew that if she didn't act now, the charity trap she had planned would be her only hope of survival. The gala was held in a sprawling glass conservatory, a structure that felt more like a cage than a ballroom. Alara arrived not as a performer, but as a guest of Vivienne Royce. She wore a gown of midnight blue, her face bare and defiant. She moved through the crowd like a silent rebuke to every person who had turned their back on her 5 years ago. Seelan was there, standing at the edge of the fountain, his eyes tracking Alara's every move with a hunger that was both terrifying and tragic. He wanted to speak, to beg, to explain, but the wall Alara had built around herself was impenetrable. The centerpiece of the evening was the auction of the Royce Star, a blue diamond brooch that had belonged to Keelan's mother. It was a piece of history, a symbol of the family's legacy. Maribel had ensured that Alara was assigned a private dressing room near the vault, and while the champagne flowed, she put her plan into motion. With the help of her father's loyalists, Maribel had the brooch stolen from its display case minutes before the auction was set to begin. She didn't just want it gone, she wanted it found in Alara's possession. As the alarm blared through the conservatory, cutting the music and silencing the laughter, the charity trap was sprung. The security team, directed by a concerned Maribel, marched straight to Alara's dressing room. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," Maribel said to the gathering crowd, her voice loud enough to carry to the back of the room. "But I saw Alara near the vault earlier. She's always had such a difficult relationship with money. We shouldn't judge her too harshly for being tempted." The doors to the dressing room were thrown open. The security chief reached into the pocket of Alara's discarded coat and pulled out a velvet pouch. Inside, the Royce Star glittered under the harsh lights. The gasps from the socialites were like a physical weight. Maribel's face was a mask of feigned pity, but her eyes were dancing with triumph. She looked at Seelan, expecting him to finally cast the thief out once and for all. But Seelan didn't move. He stood at the front of the crowd, his gaze fixed not on the diamond, but on Alara. He saw the way she stood, Unflinching, her arms crossed, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at a hunter who had been waiting for the trap to close. "Is this what you wanted, Maribel?" Alara asked, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the murmurs. "Did you think I would come back to this house without knowing exactly how you play your games?" Alara reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, sleek tablet. She turned the screen toward the audience. It was a high-definition feed from a hidden camera she had placed in her own dressing room hours earlier. The video played in a loop. It showed Maribel's personal assistant entering the room, sliding the velvet pouch into Alara's coat, and nodding to someone off camera before slipping back out. The silence that followed was absolute. The charity trap hadn't just failed. It had backfired with a force that left Maribel gasping for air. Alara didn't stop there. She tapped the screen again, and a series of scanned documents appeared, the truth in the files that Silas had uncovered. "Since we are talking about theft," Alara continued, stepping toward Maribel, "let's talk about the 5 years of my life you stole. Let's talk about the miscarriage that never happened. These are the records from the Voss family's private clinic. They show a payment of $2 million to forge a pregnancy and a subsequent loss. You didn't lose a child, Maribel. You manufactured a tragedy to cover up your father's debts." The conservatory erupted into chaos. Vivienne Royce stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury as she looked at the woman she had almost welcomed into her family. Seelan felt a wave of nausea hit him. The miscarriage had been the foundation of his hatred for Alara. It was the reason he had stood in the rain and told her to die, and it was a lie. A cheap, expensive, calculated lie. Maribel stumbled back, her eyes darting around the room for an exit. "It's not true, she forged those. Seelan, you have to believe me." But Seelan wasn't listening. He walked past Maribel as if she were a piece of trash on the floor. He went straight to Alara, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Alara, I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," she replied, her voice a whip crack of truth. "You wanted someone to blame for your own misery, and you chose me. But this is only the beginning, Seelan. You haven't even seen the bill for what you really owe." As the police arrived to take the statement regarding the diamond theft, Alara walked out into the cool night air. She had won this round, but the victory felt hollow. Her mind was already back at the hospital, where the clock was still ticking for Lyra. The charity trap had exposed Maribel's greed, but it hadn't saved her daughter's life. Behind her, she heard the sound of running footsteps. Kalen caught up to her at the gates, his face a mask of agony. He grabbed her arm, his grip desperate. "Alara, wait, please. I'll make it right. I'll give you anything. I'll destroy the Voss family. Just tell me what you need." Alara turned to him, the moonlight reflecting in her eyes. She looked at the man who had abandoned her, the man who was the only hope for their daughter's survival. She realized that the time for secrets was over. The debt of blood had to be collected. "What I need," she said, her voice trembling for the first time that night, "is for you to come to the hospital. There is someone you haven't met, someone who is dying because you were too blind to see the truth." Kalen stood frozen as Alara climbed into her car and drove away. The weight of her words settled into his bones like lead. He didn't know who was in that hospital, but he knew that the world he had built was about to be leveled to the ground. The charity trap had ended, but the true war for the Royce legacy and the life of a little genius had only just reached its most dangerous phase. The villains were exposed, but the stakes had never been higher. The aftermath of the charity gala left a trail of ruined reputations and shattered glass, but for Alara Wynne, the victory over Maribel Voss was a secondary concern. The true battle was now contained within the sterile, humming walls of the hospital's private research lab. Dr. Silas Hart sat before a glowing monitor, his eyes bloodshot from hours of cross-referencing encrypted files and medical history. The truth in the files was no longer just a suspicion. It was a devastating weapon of clarity. As the sun began to bleed into the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the laboratory floor, Alara entered. She didn't ask if he had found it. She could see the answer in the way Silas slumped in his chair. He turned the screen toward her, revealing a digitized folder that had been buried under 3 layers of Royce Group security encryptions. Files managed by Dorian Voss, Maribel's father and the architect of the Royce family's greatest tragedies. It wasn't just a fake pregnancy, Alara, Silas said, his voice raspy with disbelief. I went deeper into the donor logs from 5 years ago. Look at the date of the miscarriage and look at the internal transfer of funds from Dorian Voss's offshore accounts. He didn't just pay to fake a medical report. He paid to ensure that your own prenatal records were flagged as inconclusive and high risk for genetic deformity. Alara leaned in, her breath hitching. She saw the digital trail, a systematic erasure of her health as a mother. Dorian hadn't just wanted her gone, he had wanted Kaylin to believe that her child was a mistake of biology. But the most horrifying discovery lay at the bottom of the file. Silas pulled up a grainy, scanned document from 20 years ago, a police report from the night Seelin and his elder brother, Alaric Royce, had been kidnapped. The kidnapping that traumatized Seelin, the one that left Alaric in a coma. Silas pointed to a signature on the ransom negotiation logs. The anonymous tipster who led the police to the location wasn't a hero. It was Dorian Voss. He staged the rescue to look like a benefactor, cementing the Voss family's tie to the Royce fortune forever. Maribel isn't the savior's daughter. She is the daughter of the man who broke Keelan's family in the first place. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Alara realized that every moment of her suffering, every tear she had shed on that rooftop, had been part of a 20-year-long heist. The Voss family were parasites who had fed on Keelan's guilt, and Seelin had been their most devoted protector. Meanwhile, at the Royce villa, Keelan Royce was a man possessed. He had spent the night in his private study, surrounded by the debris of his past. The words Alara had spoken at the gala, the accusation of a manufactured tragedy, were a poison in his veins. He had summoned his lead auditor and a private investigator, giving them a single command: find every medical record associated with Maribel Voss and Alara Wynne from the last 5 years. If a single page is missing, consider your career's over. By midnight, the investigator returned with a frantic expression. He reported that the server room at the Voss clinic had been accidentally flooded an hour after the gala. The physical files were gone, but Kaylin wasn't the man he was 5 years ago. He was a hunter who had finally realized he was being played. He bypassed the clinic entirely and went to the one place Dorian Voss couldn't touch, the insurance cloud servers. As Seelin watched the recovered files download, his world collapsed. He saw the forgery. He saw the fake ultrasound photos that Maribel had used to trap him. He saw the receipts for the blood used on the stairs. But most importantly, he found a deleted memo from Dorian Voss to a local orphanage, dated 4 years ago, inquiring about discreet placement for a child born to a woman who had committed suicide. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the heart. He stood up so quickly his chair overturned. He realized that when he had told Alara to jump, he hadn't just been rejecting a wife he hated. He had been participating in the murder of his own truth. He felt a sudden, violent urge to find her. Not to apologize, for an apology felt like an insult to the magnitude of his sin, but to beg for a chance to stand between her and the darkness he had helped create. But the villains were not waiting for the truth to catch up with them. In a darkened villa on the outskirts of the city, Maribel Voss was no longer the elegant socialite. She was a cornered animal, her eyes darting between her father and the suitcase of cash on the bed. Dorian Voss sat in the shadows, his breathing heavy and rattling. He was a dying man, and his desperation had reached a fever pitch. "Seelin is digging, Dad," Maribel hissed, her voice trembling with a lethal edge. "He saw the files at the gala. He's going to find out about the kidnapping. He's going to find out about everything." "Then we play our final card," Dorian wheezed, his voice a dry rasp. "The child, the little genius in room 402. Silas Hart's logs say she needs a marrow match. My blood is failing, Maribel. If I'm going to live to see the Royce fortune in our hands, I need that child. She is a Royce. Her blood is the only thing that can stabilize my system." Maribel's eyes widened. She realized that her father's plan had shifted from simple theft to biological harvest. She didn't care about the child's life. She only cared about her father's survival because he was the only one who knew where the offshore assets were hidden. She agreed. If they couldn't have the Royce name, they would take the Royce blood. As the chapter closed, the truth in the files had set two different paths in motion. Alara and Silas were armed with the evidence of a 20-year crime, while Seelan was armed with the agonizing weight of his own regret. But the Voss family was armed with something far more dangerous: the location of Lyra Wynne. The little genius was no longer just a secret daughter. She was a biological prize in a war of shadows. The clock was no longer just ticking for Lyra's illness. It was ticking for her safety. The brilliant retribution Alara had planned was about to collide with a villain's final, desperate gamble, and the debt of blood was about to be paid in full. The city was cloaked in a deceptive silence, the kind that precedes a landslide. While the lights of the Royce villa burned late with Kaelin's burgeoning realization, and while Alara stood guard over a sleeping Lyra, a far more sinister plot was unfolding in the darkened offices of the Voss clinic. Maribel Voss was no longer playing the part of the polished socialite. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes bloodshot, and her voice a jagged edge of desperation as she looked at her father, Dorian Voss. Dorian sat in a specialized medical chair, his skin the color of parchment. The villain's desperation had reached its final lethal phase. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the blood of others, first by kidnapping the Royce brothers 20 years ago, and later by orchestrating Alara's downfall. But time and biology were the only enemies he couldn't bribe. His bone marrow was failing, and the little genius in room 402 was no longer just a secret to be kept. She was a biological resource to be harvested. "The girl is the only way, Maribel," Dorian wheezed, his breath rattling in his chest like dry leaves. "She is a direct Royce descendant. Her stem cells are the only ones compatible enough to save me. If I die, Seelan's investigators will find the offshore accounts. They'll find the records of the kidnapping. We'll lose everything. To save the legacy, we must take the child." Maribel didn't hesitate. Her conscience had been cauterized long ago by greed. She knew that Kaelin was on the verge of discovering the truth about Lyra's parentage. If he claimed the girl, Maribel would be cast out of the Royce inner circle forever. But if the girl disappeared, if she became a medical donor in a private, hidden facility, Maribel could maintain her leverage. The plan was executed with the cold efficiency of a military strike. Using a forged transfer order and a team of specialized transporters dressed as hospital staff, Maribel exploited the chaos of the hospital's night shift change. They didn't just walk into room 402. They neutralized the security cameras and silenced the night nurse. Alara had stepped away for only 10 minutes to consult with Dr. Silas Hart about a new experimental treatment. When she returned, the room was empty. The blueprints Lyra had been working on were scattered across the floor, and the small, electronic tablet she had been fixing lay smashed near the bed. "Lyra!" Alara's scream echoed through the sterile corridor, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that brought Silas running. "She's gone! They took her!" The hospital was plunged into an immediate lockdown, but the little genius was already being driven toward a secluded villa owned by Rexton Hale, a man whose loyalty Dorian Voss had bought years ago. While Alara collapsed into Silas's arms, her mind fracturing under the weight of her worst nightmare, Seelan Royce arrived at the hospital. He had come to confront Alara with the truth he had found in the files, but he found a crime scene instead. He saw the shattered tablet on the floor, he saw the blueprints, and he saw the look of absolute soul-destroying terror on Alara's face. "Where is she?" Kaelin demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that silenced the panicked hospital staff. "Where is my daughter?" Alara turned to him, her eyes burning with a hatred so cold it made the air around them freeze. She didn't offer him the comfort of a shared grief. She lunged at him, her hands clawing at his expensive suit. "Your daughter?" she spat, her voice a jagged whisper. "You don't get to call her that. You're the reason they could take her. If you hadn't left us in the rain, if you hadn't protected Maribel for 5 years, she would be safe. She's dying, Kaelin. She needs a transplant, and now she's in the hands of the people who want to use her as a biological shield." Kaelin felt a physical pain in his chest, a sensation of his own heart being torn out. He realized the magnitude of his sin. He had been a guardian for a viper, while his own flesh and blood was fading away in a hospital bed. He didn't waste time on apologies. He knew he hadn't earned them. He pulled out his phone and made a single call to Tobias Grant, the Royce family's most trusted security specialist. "Lock down every exit from the city," Seelan ordered, his voice echoing with a terrifying authority. "Every private airfield, every pier, every warehouse. I want the Voss family found. And tell Rexton Hale that if a single hair on that child's head is harmed, I will not only kill him, I will erase his entire lineage from history." The hunt was on, but Maribel and Dorian were already at the hidden villa, preparing for the forced extraction. Dorian lay on a gurney next to Lyra, who was sedated but still clutching a small metal gear she had hidden in her hand. Even in her sleep, the little genius was calculating. Maribel stood over the girl, looking at the face that so clearly belonged to the Royce family. She felt a twinge of fear, not of the law, but of the vengeance she knew was coming. "We have to be fast, Dad," she whispered. "Kalen isn't a man who follows the rules when he's angry. If he finds us before the procedure is finished—" "He won't," Dorian wheezed, his eyes fixed on the IV line. "By the time he finds us, I will have the blood I need to survive, and the girl will be a tragic medical casualty. We've killed Alara Wynn once. We can do it again through her child." The chapter closed with the city in a state of high-tension alert. Alara and Seelan, two enemies bound by a single desperate cause, stood in the hospital room, a room that felt like a tomb. The debt of blood had moved beyond money and beyond revenge. It was now a race against time and a battle against a villain's final, murderous desperation. The hunter was now the protector, and the mother was a warrior with nothing left to lose. The brilliant retribution Alara had dreamed of was now the only thing standing between Lyra and a silent, hidden grave. The night air at the hidden villa of Rexton Hale was thick with the scent of ozone and the looming threat of a violent storm. Inside a makeshift operating room, the grand reveal was being prepared with a cold, surgical precision. Dorian Voss lay on a gurney, his breathing now a desperate, wet rasp, while beside him, the little genius, Lyra Wynn, remained sedated. She looked like a broken doll against the white sheets, a single metal gear still clutched in her small, pale hand, a silent testament to the mind that even drugs could not fully dim. Maribel Voss stood between the two beds, her hands trembling as she adjusted the IV drip. She was no longer a socialite. She was a criminal on the edge of an abyss. She checked her watch every few seconds, the ticking sounding like a hammer against her skull. She knew that Kalen Royce and Alara Wynn were coming. She could feel the weight of their vengeance moving through the city like a heat wave. But Alara was not just coming with anger. She was coming with the ultimate weapon of the digital age. While Kalen's security teams breached the perimeter of the villa with tactical precision, Alara was in the back of a command van, her fingers flying across a laptop. She wasn't just tracking a signal, she was preparing to broadcast a funeral for the Voss reputation. "Silas, are the servers ready?" Alara asked, her voice a jagged line of determination. Dr. Silas Hart nodded beside her, his face grim. "Every major news outlet, every social media platform in the country is synced. The moment we breach that room, the world sees the truth." The breach was not a subtle affair. Seelan Royce did not knock. He tore the world apart to get to his daughter. The front gates of the Hale Villa were leveled by armored SUVs, and the front doors were shattered by the sheer force of a father who had finally found his purpose. Kalen moved through the hallways like a dark god of retribution, his eyes fixed on a single goal. When he finally kicked in the doors to the operating room, he found a scene that would haunt his dreams forever. Maribel was holding a syringe, hovering over Lyra, while Dorian watched with the predatory hunger of a dying parasite. "Step away from her, Maribel," Kalen said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to shake the very walls. "Or I will ensure that you don't live long enough to see a courtroom." Maribel let out a hysterical laugh, the sound of a mind finally snapping under the pressure. "You think you've won, Kalen? You think because you found us, it's over? This girl is the only thing that can save my father, and if she dies as a Royce casualty, just like Alara was supposed to be." But Alara stepped into the light behind Keelan, her laptop open. "Look up, Maribel," she said, her voice echoing with a chilling calmness. On the large medical monitors in the room and on every screen across the city, a video began to play. It was the recording Silas had found, the grand reveal of the Voss family's 20-year deception. The world watched as the evidence of the faked miscarriage, the forged medical records, and the secret bank transfers scrolled by. But then, the final piece of the puzzle appeared. A video confession Dorian Voss had recorded for his lawyers years ago, kept as insurance, detailing how he had kidnapped Celine and Alaric to cement his status as a hero. The world stood still as the Voss legacy crumbled in real time. Maribel watched the screens, her face turning a ghostly white as she realized that her father's brilliant retribution had become their public execution. Just as the police tactical teams flooded the room, the doors behind the operating table swung open. A figure stood there, leaning heavily on a cane, but standing with an unmistakable Royce dignity. It was Alaric Royce, the elder brother who had been in a coma for 5 years. His eyes were clear, and they were fixed on the man who had stolen his youth. "I remember the face of the man who held the gun 20 years ago, Dorian," Alaric said, his voice raspy but firm. "And it wasn't a stranger. It was you." The grand reveal was complete. Dorian Voss let out a final, rattling groan, his heart failing not from illness but from the weight of his exposed sins. He died in the shadows of the room he had built for his own salvation. Maribel was tackled to the floor, her screams of protest drowned out by the sirens and the static of the live stream. Celine didn't look at the villains. He went straight to the bed and scooped Lyra into his arms, the sedated child's head falling against his shoulder. He looked at Alara, tears finally breaking through the ice of his eyes. He realized that the little genius wasn't just a daughter he had to save. She was the only redemption he would ever have. The chapter closed with the villa being swarmed by investigators, but the focus remained on the 3 people at the center of the storm. The truth was out, the villains were broken, and Alaric had returned from the dead to witness the fall of the Voss Empire. The debt of blood had been exposed to the entire world, and as Alara took Lyra from Keelan's arms, the revenge she had sought felt secondary to the simple, miraculous sound of her daughter's breathing. The final outcome was within reach, but the transformation of the Royce family had only just begun. The rain that fell over the city was no longer the cold, punishing deluge of 5 years ago. It was a soft, rhythmic drumming against the glass of the Royce General Hospital, a sound that seemed to wash away the lingering shadows of the Voss family's legacy. Inside the penthouse suite, the air was still, broken only by the steady, healthy beep of a heart monitor, a sound that had become the most beautiful symphony Alara Wynne had ever heard. Lyra lay in the center of the bed, her color returning, her small hand no longer clutching a metal gear, but resting peacefully over the duvet. The debt of blood had been paid, but not in the way Alara had originally planned. It hadn't been settled with a check or a public shaming, but with a successful bone marrow transplant. The donor had been the only match possible: Celine Royce. Celine stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deep by a week of sleepless nights and the physical toll of the procedure. He was a man who had spent his life building skyscrapers, yet he had never felt as tall as he did when he looked at the small girl who shared his blood. He didn't turn when he heard Alara approach. He couldn't bear to see the ghost of the woman he had wronged in the eyes of the woman who had saved him. "The doctors say she'll be discharged in 48 hours, Alara said, her voice quiet, but no longer carrying the jagged edge of ice. "She's already asking for her tools. She wants to optimize the hospital's air filtration system." A ghost of a smile touched Keelan's lips, but it faded as quickly as it appeared. He finally turned, his gaze dropping to the floor. He spoke not as a CEO, but as a man standing in the wreckage of his own soul. He told her that he had signed the papers, the ones that transferred 51% of the Royce Group's voting shares into a trust for Lyra. He had also signed the confession for the police regarding his negligence 5 years ago. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was merely clearing the ledger. But Alara didn't look at the papers. She looked at the man. She realized that the brilliant retribution she had envisioned, Kalen's total ruin, was no longer necessary. Life had already exacted a higher price than she ever could. Kalen would live the rest of his days knowing that he had almost murdered his own salvation. That was a prison no courtroom could ever build. The scene shifted to the steps of the High Court the following morning. The brilliant retribution was being televised to millions, but the focus was not on the Royce family's wealth, but on the fall of the Voss dynasty. Maribel Voss was led away in handcuffs, her face pale and sunken, her designer clothes replaced by a drab gray jumpsuit. Beside her, the assets of the Voss clinic were being seized, and the records of 20 years of kidnappings and forgeries were being handed over to the state. Standing on the courthouse steps, Alaric Royce spoke to the press for the first time since waking from his coma. He stood with the strength of a man who had reclaimed his life. He publicly thanked Alara Wynne, not as a dancer or a masked swan, but as the woman who had brought the truth back to the Royce family. He announced that the Royce Group would be restructured, with a new focus on medical ethics and transparency, a legacy for the girl who was too smart to be lied to. As the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, Alara stood at the back of the crowd, wearing a simple white dress. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer a ghost. She looked toward the edge of the plaza, where Talon stood in the rain, holding an umbrella, not over himself but over a small, bright yellow raincoat. Lyra looked up at her father, her intelligent eyes scanning his face. She didn't call him Dad, not yet, but she reached out and took his hand, her small fingers curling around his thumb. It was a fragile beginning, a bridge built over a 5-year abyss. Talon looked at Alara across the distance, a silent plea for a future he hadn't yet earned. Alara didn't walk toward him. She didn't need to. The debt of blood was settled. She had her daughter, she had her name, and she had the peace that comes from a war finally won. She turned and walked toward her own car, her head held high. She was a successful artist, a mother, and a survivor. The story of the Royce family would continue, but the chapter of betrayal was closed. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, golden rays over the city, the narrator's voice softened into a final reflection. 5 years ago, a woman jumped into the rain to escape a lie. Today, she walked into the sunlight to embrace the truth. Celan Royce would spend his life in the rain of his own regret, watching the woman he loved and the daughter he cherished from the distance he had created. And Alara Wynne? She proved that the most brilliant revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies, but the absolute, undeniable beauty of your own survival. The lights of the city began to twinkle like the stars Lyra loved to study. The little genius would grow up in a world where the truth was no longer a secret, and where the masked swan had finally found a way to dance without a mask. The game was over. The debt was paid, and the phoenix had not just risen, she had flown.